We are not running a daycare service here. You'll want to reconsider.
I don't think so.
This isn't a game. Mr. Revs, we weren't told you'd be here.
My apologies, it was a last-minute decision.
This is highly irregular. Mr. Reeves is the founder and majority owner of Reeves Holdings.
That's correct.
Nobody in that
That's
office
not
knew his name.
possible.
To them, he was just the janitor's coat and worn-out shoes. A quiet man who mopped floors, picked up his daughter from daycare every evening at exactly 5, and never said a word out of place. So when the young HR manager fired him in front of the whole break room, mocking his shabby jacket and calling him an embarrassment to the building, she expected silence. She got it. What she didn't expect was the black SUV that pulled up outside 3 days later. Then another. And another. 10 of them in total. She was about to learn exactly who she'd humiliated, and it was already too late to take it back. His name was Daniel Reeves, though almost no one at Calder Tower bothered to learn it. To them, he was the maintenance guy, a man in a gray uniform who arrived before sunrise and left after the last light in the building switched off. He mopped the marble lobby floors until they gleamed, fixed the elevators when they stuttered, and said good morning to people who never said it back. What none of them knew, what he made sure none of them knew, was that the elevator he repaired, the marble he polished, and the very air conditioning humming through every vent belonged to him. 3 years earlier, Daniel had stepped back from the company he built from nothing, a logistics and real estate empire that quietly owned buildings across 4 states, including Calder Tower itself. After his wife passed, he made a decision that stunned his board and his lawyers alike. He would disappear from the spotlight, raise his daughter Mia without bodyguards or headlines, and remind himself, through ordinary, humbling work, what it felt like to be seen simply as a man, not a fortune. He told no one at the building who he was. He wanted, for once, to be judged only by his actions. It should have been simple. Instead, it became a quiet endurance test. The one who made it hardest was Vanessa Cole, the newly appointed HR director for the tenant company on the 14th floor, a fast-growing marketing firm that leased 3 full floors of Calder Tower. Vanessa was sharp, ambitious, and deeply convinced that appearances told the whole story of a person's worth. She'd built her reputation on efficiency metrics and cost-cutting, and somewhere along the way, she'd decided that people like Daniel, men in gray uniforms who kept their heads down, existed somewhere beneath her notice. It started small. A clipped, "You're blocking the elevator," when he was simply waiting his turn like everyone else. A sharp comment when he asked maintenance requests be routed through proper channels instead of being shouted at him in the hallway. Daniel absorbed it all without complaint. He'd learned, in his years of building an empire from the ground up, that the loudest people in a room were rarely the most dangerous, and the ones worth watching were the ones who thought they had nothing to prove. Then came the morning that changed everything. Mia's school had called Daniel just after 8, a stomach bug going around. And could he confirm early pickup? He asked his supervisor for 2 minutes to step outside and make the call. Vanessa happened to be walking through the lobby at that exact moment, irritated after a rough morning meeting, and she seized the opportunity to make an example of him. "We are not running a daycare service here," she said, loud enough for the security desk and 2 waiting tenants to hear. "If you can't manage your personal life, maybe this isn't the job for you." Daniel said nothing. He simply nodded, pocketed his phone, and walked back to his cart. But something in his silence unsettled her more than an argument would have. People who had nothing to lose usually fought back. People who said nothing usually knew something she didn't. She should have paid attention to that instinct. She didn't. Over the following weeks, Vanessa's disdain sharpened into something closer to obsession. She complained to building management that the maintenance staff felt too visible, too present, as if his mere existence in common spaces was an inconvenience to the polished image she wanted the firm to project. She began finding small reasons to reprimand him: a squeaky cartwheel, a 5-minute delay in unclogging a break room sink. Anything that let her assert authority over someone she'd already decided didn't matter. What she never noticed, because she never looked closely enough, were the details that should have given her pause. The way building security nodded to him with unusual respect. The way the property manager, A woman named Teresa, who'd worked at Calder Tower for over a decade, always seemed just a little too deferential around the maintenance guy, always double-checking with him before finalizing decisions that, by rights, belonged solely to her. The way, once, Daniel had quietly overridden a vendor contract dispute with a single phone call that made an entire delivery company suddenly inexplicably cooperative. Nobody put the pieces together, least of all Vanessa. Then came the incident that sealed everything. It was a Thursday, and Mia's school had another early release. A teacher conference day Daniel had somehow missed on the calendar. He asked, politely, for the same 2 minutes he'd asked for weeks earlier. This time, Vanessa didn't just scold him. She marched him to the front desk in front of colleagues, co-workers, and 2 visiting clients, and told him coldly and deliberately that his employment was terminated, effective immediately, that a man who couldn't get his priorities straight had no business being trusted with keys to a building full of professionals. The break room went silent. A few co-workers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one intervened. Nobody wanted to be the next target of Vanessa's temper. Daniel simply looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, not with panic, but with something closer to quiet disappointment, as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected about her from the very beginning. He took off his badge, set it gently on the counter, and said only 4 words before walking out the glass doors. "You'll want to reconsider." Vanessa laughed. Actually laughed, right there in front of everyone, dismissing it as the empty bravado of a man with nothing left to threaten her with. She had no idea how wrong she was. 3 days passed. Vanessa barely thought of him again, until Thursday morning, when Teresa, the property manager, appeared at her office door pale-faced, asking if she'd heard about the emergency ownership meeting scheduled in the main conference room. Vanessa hadn't. No one from her firm had been informed of any meeting. That should have been her first warning. The second came 20 minutes later when the building's entire lobby went quiet. The kind of hush that falls over a room right before something enormous happens. Vanessa, curious despite herself, walked toward the window overlooking the front entrance and saw them. One black SUV pulling up to the curb, then another, then a third, fourth, fifth. A slow, deliberate procession of vehicles that made pedestrians stop and stare, that made the security guards at the front desk suddenly stand up straighter, adjusting their jackets as if preparing for royalty. Vanessa felt something cold settle low in her stomach, an instinct she couldn't yet name, but that screamed at her to pay attention. She had spent weeks dismissing a quiet man in a gray uniform as beneath her notice. She was about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption had been, and there would be no taking back what she'd already said. The doors of the lead SUV opened before it had even fully stopped, and the man who stepped out was not who Vanessa expected. Not Daniel, not yet. It was a tall man in a charcoal suit, flanked by 2 others carrying leather folios, moving with the brisk, practiced efficiency of people who worked for someone far more important than themselves. Behind them, the remaining vehicles emptied one by one. Legal counsel, a member of the city's commercial real estate board, and finally, stepping out of the last car with the same quiet composure he'd carried every single day in his gray uniform, was Daniel. Only now he wasn't wearing the uniform. He wore a tailored navy suit that fit like it had been made for him, because it had. Gone was the maintenance cart, the badge, the deferential posture. What replaced it was unmistakable, the bearing of a man who had built something enormous and had simply chosen for a while to set it down. Vanessa's mouth went dry. Around her, the lobby had gone completely silent, employees pausing mid-step, phones lowering, the morning's ordinary rhythm collapsing into stunned stillness. Teresa, the property manager, rushed forward first, extending a hand that trembled slightly. "Mr. Reeves, we weren't told you'd be... We would have prepared the boardroom, we would have..." "I didn't want it prepared," Daniel said calmly. "I wanted it exactly like this." The words hit Vanessa like a physical blow. Mr. Reeves. The maintenance man had a last name that people said with reverence. She felt her colleagues' eyes shifting toward her, the weight of dozens of stares she hadn't earned and didn't want. Daniel walked through the lobby with unhurried purpose, his legal team falling into step behind him, until he stood directly in front of Vanessa, the same spot where, 3 days earlier, she had told him he had no business being trusted with keys to the building. I believe you had some concerns, he said, about a man who couldn't manage his priorities. Vanessa opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Every sharp, practiced word she'd ever used to diminish him evaporated in the face of what was unfolding in front of her, in front of everyone. One of the men beside Daniel stepped forward and addressed the gathering crowd, his voice carrying easily across the marble lobby. For those who don't know, Mr. Reeves is the founder and majority owner of Reeves Holdings, which owns Calder Tower and 11 other commercial properties across this state, along with a controlling interest in 3 of the companies currently leasing space in this building, including, he paused, letting his gaze settle deliberately on Vanessa, Halstead Marketing Group. A ripple went through the crowd, whispers, a sharp intake of breath from someone near the elevators. Vanessa felt her knees weaken as the pieces assembled themselves with brutal clarity. Halstead Marketing Group, her employer, the company that paid her salary, that had trusted her with the authority to hire and fire, all of it, ultimately, answerable to the very man she'd humiliated in front of a room full of witnesses. "That's not possible," she managed finally, her voice thinner than she intended. You were emptying trash cans. You were fixing elevators." "I was choosing to," Daniel said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only a steady, devastating calm that was somehow worse than anger would have been. "After my wife passed, I needed to remember what it felt like to be treated as a person and not a balance sheet. I wanted to know which of the people in my buildings, in my companies, actually had character, and which only performed decency when they thought someone important was watching." He let that settle for a moment before continuing. "You failed that test in the first week, Ms. Cole. Not because I was inconvenienced by your rudeness. Because you fired a man, a father, for asking 2 minutes to make sure his daughter was safe. You didn't know who I was. That's exactly the point. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with basic respect. You chose not to anyway. The silence that followed was total. Somewhere behind Vanessa, a co-worker who had once laughed along with her jokes about the maintenance guy quietly stepped back, putting visible distance between herself and the woman at the center of the room. Another employee, a young man who'd occasionally offered Daniel a nod or a kind word in passing, allowed himself a small, disbelieving smile, the sudden, dizzying realization that decency had, in fact, been the smarter bet all along. Vanessa's employer, the actual CEO of Halstead Marketing Group, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had built his firm's reputation on polish and image, arrived moments later, alerted by a frantic call from his assistant. He pushed through the gathering crowd, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to alarm as he took in the scene, his HR director, pale and cornered, standing before the very man who held his company's lease. His investment terms and, as his general counsel would later confirm in a much quieter, much more urgent conversation, a controlling stake in Halstead's newest and most critical funding round. "Daniel, Mr. Reeves," Pruitt stammered, extending a hand that hovered, uncertain whether it would be accepted. "I had no idea that this was Vanessa. What exactly did you do?" Vanessa said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't make things worse. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'll be having a longer conversation with your board about how this incident was handled," he said to Pruitt, "and about whether the values your company claims to represent match the way your staff actually treat people they assume don't matter." He turned, finally, to look at Vanessa directly one last time, not with triumph, not with vengeance, but with the same quiet disappointment she'd seen in his eyes the day she fired him. "You had every opportunity to simply be kind," he said. "That's all this was ever about." Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, to explain, to salvage something from the wreckage of the last 5 minutes. But before a single word could form, Pruitt's phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced down, and the color drained from his face as he read the message from his general counsel. 3 words that would define everything that happened next. "He's pulling funding." The message on Gerald Pruitt's phone set off a chain of events that would unfold over the following weeks, with the quiet, unstoppable momentum of dominoes falling in slow motion. Reeves Holdings didn't simply pull its funding out of spite. Daniel had never operated that way, not in 20 years of building his company from a single warehouse lease into an empire spanning 4 states. Instead, what followed was something far more deliberate. A full review of Halstead Marketing Group's internal culture, triggered by the incident in the lobby and conducted by an outside firm Daniel's team brought in within days. It didn't take long for the reviewers to find what they were looking for. Vanessa Cole's file, once they started digging, was thicker than anyone expected. Complaints from former employees who'd been too afraid to escalate them. A pattern of dismissive treatment toward anyone she deemed beneath her. Contractors, junior staff, a delivery driver she'd once had removed from the building for loitering when he was simply waiting on a signature. None of it had ever reached leadership before because leadership had never asked. Vanessa had always been efficient, always hit her numbers, always kept the appearance of a well-run department. Appearances, it turned out, had been doing a great deal of covering. She was terminated within the month, not directly by Daniel, who made a point of staying out of Halstead's internal decisions, but by Pruitt himself, who understood with painful clarity that keeping her on staff was no longer a viable option if he wanted to keep his company's lease, his investors, and his reputation intact. The termination meeting was brief. There were no 10 black SUVs, no dramatic entrance, no crowd of witnesses. Just a quiet, procedural end to a career built on the assumption that some people would never have the power to push back. Vanessa's exit made no headlines. That, in some ways, was its own kind of quiet justice. The same anonymity she'd denied Daniel, the same invisibility she'd assumed he'd always live in, was now the exact thing she'd have to disappear into herself. She would go on to find work eventually at a smaller firm, in a role with considerably less authority and, according to people who later worked with her, a noticeably different approach to how she treated the people beneath her on an org chart. Whether that change came from genuine reflection or simple fear of it happening again, no one could say for certain. Perhaps it didn't matter. The lesson had been learned, one way or another. For Daniel, the aftermath looked entirely different. He didn't return to the gray uniform. There was no need to continue the disguise once the truth had surfaced so publicly. Word travels fast in a city, and within days, most of Calder Tower's staff and tenants knew exactly who had been mopping their floors and greeting them each morning with a quiet good morning that most had never bothered to return. What surprised people wasn't that he'd been wealthy all along. It was how little that fact seemed to matter to him. He kept his office in the building modest, functional, nothing like the glass-walled corner suites most executives of his stature demanded. He continued picking Mia up from school every single day at 5 o'clock, though now it was in a car with a driver instead of a 15-year-old sedan with a check engine light that never quite went away. Teresa, the property manager, later admitted to a colleague that in the months following the reveal, Daniel changed almost nothing about his daily habits, still learned the names of every new hire, still remembered which tenants had kids starting school that fall, still stopped to ask the security guards how their weekends had gone. The uniform was gone. The man underneath it wasn't. What did change was smaller, quieter, but perhaps more significant than anything else that happened in the weeks following his reveal. Reeves Holdings implemented a new policy across every property and company under its umbrella, an anonymous feedback channel where any employee, at any level, could report how they were treated by supervisors and executives, with real investigations following every credible complaint. Daniel called it simply the 2-minute policy, a quiet, permanent reminder of the day a young father had asked for 2 minutes to check on his daughter and been humiliated for it. It became one of the most talked-about workplace initiatives in the region that year, not because it was revolutionary in structure, but because everyone understood exactly where it had come from. Mia, for her part, never fully understood why people suddenly treated her father differently, why teachers at pickup lingered a little longer to shake his hand, why the mothers at school functions who'd once barely acknowledged him now went out of their way to strike up conversation. She was 7. All she knew was that her dad still packed her lunch every morning, still let her pick the radio station on the drive to school, still showed up exactly when he said he would. To her, nothing about him had changed at all, because in the ways that mattered most to a 7-year-old, nothing had. The story of what happened at Calder Tower spread the way these things do, not through press releases, but through the people who'd witnessed it firsthand, retelling it to friends and colleagues until it became something close to local legend. The maintenance man who owned the building, the HR director who fired a billionaire without knowing it, 10 black SUVs pulling up outside a company that had no idea what was about to hit them,